Hi, and thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I'm Matt Scholz with the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, and our guest today is Professor Emeritus from the University of Michigan, Dr. Don Scavia. He's had a long and distinguished career of assessing the impacts of human activities on both coastal and freshwater ecosystems in places such as the Gulf of Mexico, the Chesapeake Bay, and the subject of today's discussion, the Great Lakes. Don's been deeply involved in doing research that informs the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is a binational and multi-jurisdictional agreement that commits to significant phosphorus load reductions to the Great Lakes. As part of that agreement, the US and Canada committed to domestic action plans that focus quite a bit on loads coming from the Detroit and Amami rivers. However, the sources of the Detroit River loads have been difficult to pin down. Don's recent work addresses this knowledge gap and is being published in the Journal of Great Lakes Research under the title Detroit River Phosphorus Loads, Anatomy of a Binational Watershed. Thank you, Don, for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. So I guess I'll start with talking a little bit about my collaborators and the funders. This was a 3-year project, so we had a pretty big team. All of these folks were at the University of Michigan at the time, but we've successfully launched a couple of postdocs and some research scientists who have now gone on to some other places. I won't talk about them individually other than to say it was a wonderful group to work with. The project was funded by the Fred and Barbara Erb Family Foundation, which is a foundation focusing in the Southeast Michigan area with a strong interest in the Great Lakes, and they've been a great funder for us over the years.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So the focus today is on this re-eutrophication of Lake Erie. Lake Erie is the southernmost and most productive of the North American Great Lakes. Lake Erie was famously declared dead in the 1960s and 70s, and there was a very successful cleanup program following that in the 70s and the 80s. And which worked quite well. It focused on the point sources from the treatment plants and other sources, and really dramatically cleaned up the lake. The harmful algal blooms were significantly decreased. The hypoxia was also decreased. The dead zone in the central basin was decreased. But in the 1990s, things reversed. And now the harmful algal blooms and hypoxia are as large or larger than they were in the 1960s. The upper right-hand corner shows you one of the most dramatic toxic blooms in the western central basin of Lake Erie, and the bottom right shows you the typical sizes of the dead zone in the central basin of Lake Erie in the most recent years since the mid-1980s. And so this reversal was a very significant problem identified by the public and by the US and Canadian agencies. And as a result, the US and Canada binational agreement, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, that has been in place since the 1970s, was revised in 2012. The focus was on the phytoplankton biomass in the western basin, the cyanobacteria, the toxic algae blooms in the western basin, also hypoxia, or the dead zone in the central basin, and cladophora biomass, the buildup of cladophora on the shorelines in the eastern basin. There's a lot of details involved, but ultimately the agreement between US and Canada was to reduce the loads of phosphorus to Lake Erie by 40%, a 40% reduction from the 2008 levels. There are nuances involved, but that's the key one to focus on. This is a map showing the relative loads of phosphorus to Lake Erie. The arrows are all drawn to scale. So as what's pretty obvious is the Detroit River and the Maumee River are the two largest sources to Lake Erie. Together, they deliver almost 90% of the phosphorus load to the western basin and over half of the load to the total lake. There had been a number of studies, that we did, focused on the Maumee River, looking at its role in Lake Erie, looking at what might need to be done in its watershed to reduce its load by 40%. This project that I'm talking about today focused on the Detroit River and the Detroit River Watershed. It's a massive watershed. It's binational. It's almost 20,000 square kilometers. 40% of it sits in Michigan, 60% sits in Ontario. It's almost half cropland, 20% urban, 13% forest, and then 7% in grasslands and water. Interestingly, most of the agricultural lands are in Ontario, and most of the urban land is in Michigan. And what makes this even more interesting, a little bit more difficult, is right in the middle of this watershed, there's this 1,115 square kilometer lake, Lake St. Clair, that actually receives the load from 5 of the 6 major sub-watersheds before it continues on into the Detroit River, into Lake Erie. So we had to figure out what role that lake
What role it had, yeah.
Yeah.
Is this shifting more towards ag or more towards urban over time?
I think the ag has been pretty extensive and pretty consistent on the Ontario side. The urban areas, Detroit, the Detroit metro area is the largest area, and the Detroit metro population has decreased, but the overall area surrounding Detroit has increased. So they've been pretty stable during the last decade or so.
Yeah, great, thanks.
So the effort began with this massive binational assembling of data. We had to, first of all, reconcile the different approaches to data management and different structures in the US and Canadian data. As you can see on this left-hand side, we accumulated flow measurements throughout the major streams and rivers. Phosphorus concentrations are the red dots. We also assembled all the information on point sources, that's what the X's, and the combined sewer overflows, which we thought might have been significant contribution. Those are the little circles. In the middle part, we blew up the central focus coming from Lake Huron down through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, and then into the Detroit River and down into Lake Erie, because that's a major focus of the effort. Having assembled all the model, we then integrated those models and looked at the analysis with 4 different models. We did a mass balance, basically an arithmetic calculation mass balance model for the St. Clair Detroit River system. We employed a SWAT model, soil and water assessment tool, for the watersheds on both sides of the border. We employed a SWIM model, which is a stormwater management model in the Metro Detroit area. And then LCOM-CADEN is a complicated 3-dimensional ecological model that we built and used to look at the effect of Lake St. Clair on the system. And so we had to bring all these models, reconcile them with the data, and then employ them for the analysis. We were advised by a really important multi-sector group of interests, federal agencies from both sides of the border, provincial representatives and state representatives, agricultural interests, water quality interests, environmental interests, and academic interests. It was a very large group, and they were very helpful in helping us frame the questions correctly and appropriately. They helped us get additional data, and they helped us with trying to understand the implications of the results. And they were very, very important to us. I'm going to give you the key findings now, and then go through a bit of an explanation about how we got there.
Yeah, that's great.
The first one, which is the biggest surprise of the whole study, was that the phosphorus load from Lake Huron is actually almost about a little bit more than 3 times higher than what had been assumed in earlier studies. And that represents 58% of the total load coming into the system. And interestingly, that load has been increasing over time, and we believe that's being driven by climate change and the influence of climate on sediment resuspension in Lake Huron and its ultimate delivery to the St. Clair River. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Lake St. Clair was also a bit of a surprise. There had been some studies in the 1980s that suggested that Lake St. Clair phosphorus load and input and output was pretty much in balance. That turns out to be incorrect, mostly because they assumed this lower load coming from Lake Huron. We had actual measurements to correct that, and we now are suggesting that 20% of the phosphorus going into Lake St. Clair is retained by Lake St. Clair. Then to meet the 40% total phosphorus reduction requires a 23% reduction from the 2008 loads. And that's mostly because the Detroit treatment plant has already gone through significant reductions since 2008. But we're running into difficulty because if you don't do anything about the Lake Huron load, then you have to reduce the other loads by 53%. And if you don't do anything about the Lake Huron load or the Detroit treatment plant load, since it's already been reduced, then you have to get 72% reduction from the other sources.
Yeah, some big reductions. Can I ask you about this Lake St. Clair piece?
Sure.
I noticed that in the paper, you describe it as a sink, and sinks have a way of becoming sources over time. And I'm just wondering if you had any idea of when that transition might happen. Do you have any estimates on that?
It's hard to know. I mean, the 20% is actually an average that was calculated over a 15-year period. There was not a whole lot of change during that time. And it's not totally clear where the retention is happening. We know that there's tremendous macrophyte production in the lake, which would hold it in. There's a great fish production as well. Zebra mussels are in that lake, and that's keeping it down into the sediment. And there's a fair amount being built up in the sediment. So I'm not sure we're going to see it go from a sink to a source anytime soon.
And those zebra mussels are invasive, correct?
They are, and they were a huge introduction. In fact, that's part of what happened in Lake Huron, and I'll get to that later on in the story.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so the bottom line was, if we actually are looking at something on the order of a 72% load reduction, it's going to be really hard to hit those targets from the agricultural sources, and we'll get to that as we go through. So those are the key findings. Let's walk through how we got there. So most of the data that we worked on for the mass balance study was from 1998 to 2016, and that's what this time course is. And this is comparing, these are measured loads, the top dark blue line are the measured loads that are at the bottom of the St. Clair River going into Lake St. Clair. And the Canadians had pointed out a couple of years earlier that they saw that the concentration of phosphorus at the top of the St. Clair River were actually lower than the bottom of the St. Clair River. And so one of the things that we had to find out was, is the extra phosphorus coming from other sources into the St. Clair River? And, we did everything we could to make those measurements and look at what those other sources are. And that lighter blue line is actually the lake, the measured load coming out of Lake Huron plus all the sources to the St. Clair River. And after accounting for that, there's still a difference. And this difference then, since it's not extra load into the St. Clair River, really has to be coming from Lake Huron. And so the big question was, well, if it's coming from Lake Huron, why is it not in the monitoring program? Why is it not being measured in those program that's put in place up there? Well, we had suspected that the Lake Huron resuspended sediment was being missed by the current sampling protocols. And so on the left-hand side here, this is an example of this high resuspended sediment and its transport down towards the area going out of Lake Huron. And there are two sampling programs that's on the right-hand side here. One is the EPA site at Port Huron, just below the Blue Water Bridge, and the environment, so ECCC is the Environment Climate Change Canada site at Point Edward. And so those are the two stations, and what we were suspecting is that for some reason they weren't catching all these high sediment plumes that are going by. And so what we did was we looked at satellite images from 2010, 2012, reviewed 300 usable images, and classified them in the following way. The top image was when there was a good image, but there was no resuspension. The middle one shows moderate resuspension, and the bottom one shows a big resuspension event. And in the areas where it's just white, there were unusable images, so we really couldn't tell. And so What's on the right-hand side is just the time course from 2012, showing you the duration and the timing of the no plumes, moderate plumes, and big plumes. And what we did then was superimpose the sampling time periods. This is from the Environment Canada site, and they were sampling twice a month until around 2009 or so, and then they're sampling once a month. And you can see pretty clearly here that there were some pretty significant resuspension events that would have sent much more phosphorus past that monitoring station when they weren't actually sampling. And so this is where we came to the conclusion that that load is from Lake Huron. It's just being missed by the monitoring program.
Yeah, it makes sense. So these resuspension events, you're going to get to that now. I was going to ask you, are these mostly rain driven? Are they wind driven? What causes them?
So it's mostly wind driven. So the winds are kicking up, and they get large waves and resuspend the sediment. Now, it's not clear at this point where the phosphorus is coming from that's in the sediment. There's a lot of shoreline erosion in that area, but there's also a fair amount of agriculture loading phosphorus into that shore of Lake Huron that would be building up phosphorus in the sediment. But it's mostly a wind-driven event.
Thanks.
And what was interesting is in the upper left-hand corner, this is that graph that I already showed, that difference, that unmeasured load, has actually been increasing over time, corresponding to the tremendous loss of ice cover due to global warming in the area, and an increase in the number of large wave events over 2 meters, both consistent with climate models showing that the ice cover has decreased, measured that ice cover decrease, and the waves have gone up. And it's likely to continue in those trends. And so that unmeasured load is likely being driven by a climate signal and may actually continue in the future. So given this new estimate, so what we've done now is accounted for this unmeasured load from Lake Huron. And if you put together all the sources, we have this pie diagram, and it's color-coded with the watershed map on the right-hand side. And so 58% of the total load into the system is coming from Lake Huron. And the other two major loads are the Great Lakes Water Authority. It's basically the treatment plant in Detroit, and the Thames River, which is a major agricultural watershed in Ontario. And that's where the major sources are coming from. And all the rest are shown there. So it's really important to look at the effect of Lake St. Clair on the system, because the St. Clair River goes into the lake, as well as 5 of the other watersheds. And so we had measurements of phosphorus going into the lake, which is the top dark blue line, and measurements of the phosphorus coming out of the lake, which is the lighter blue line. And the difference was always showing it as a sink during this entire time period from 2001 to 2015. On average, it was 20%. And so one of the things this does is it increases the relative importance of the downstream sources, the sources below the St. Clair River. But we had to account for that in the subsequent analysis. The other thing that was important to point out is these are the loads coming out of the treatment plant in Detroit. And by implementing additional technologies around 2009 and 2010, their load decreased by 54% since 2008. And this is the major point source in the system. It's always important to note, though, that there's about a little bit more than 100 other small point sources in this massive watershed, but by far the Detroit treatment plant is the largest contributor, and they've done a really good job of reducing the load so far. So in looking overall then, what I'm showing here are, to compare 1998, 2008, the current, at least was current, and then we did the paper average, and the target that's called for. The reduction in the phosphorus load between 98 and 2008 was mostly a reduction in Lake Huron. And that was because the zebra mussels invaded Lake Huron and sequestered tremendous amount of phosphorus from the water, keeping it into the sediment and generally in the lake. And so what was coming out of the lake was actually lower phosphorus. And that was the interesting reduction between 98 and 2008. Between 2008 and the current, again, this is the reduction in the Detroit treatment plant. And so if you look at the target, compared to where we are 2013, 2016, we have to come up with 567 metric tons of phosphorus to pull out of the river in order to hit that 40% reduction target. And so where you take that reduction from matters. Best way to look at this is the mass balance diagram I had earlier. And in order to hit that 40% target, you'd have to reduce 23% of all the loads if you were able to get all of them. If you took Lake Huron off the table, you'd have to reduce it by 51%. And if you took Lake Huron and the treatment plant off, this is where the 72% comes from. A side note, it's interesting, if you were to find a way to reduce the Lake Huron load and the treatment plant load each by about 10 to 15%, then you're in the 40 to 50% load reduction from the other watersheds. And so then we wanted to look at, well, is even 40 to 50% possible from these systems? And this is where we employed the soil and water assessment tool that USDA had built and has been used in thousands of places. And we tested individual best management practices and bundles of them. The SWOT model was calibrated to these 6 locations, covering all the major watersheds. And we looked at cover crops, wetlands, reducing the fertilizer application rate, applying buffer strips, and applying the fertilizer incorporated in the soil rather than just broadcasting it on the surface. We tested them all individually, and even if you applied each one of them individually, 100% on 100% of the land, none of them achieved the 40% load reductions by themselves. And so we had to go and looking at combinations, which is the common way to do this sort of analysis. So we looked at bundles. So each one of these graphs shows the results for total phosphorus in the dark blue and lighter phosphorus, and dissolved reactive phosphorus in the lighter blue. Each of the bars represents a different watershed, the 5 major watersheds. And then the codes on the top of each bar graph are the combinations of practices. So for example, in the upper left-hand corner, this is a combination of cover crops, filter strips, and wetlands. And the others are likely come from those that legend. And the circles are representing the major agricultural watersheds, the Sydenham and the Thames, both in Ontario. And it showed here that in these combinations, we're always getting above 40%, and a couple of them were above 60% load reduction, which was good to see. But this is now applying these practices on 100% of the agricultural land in these areas, which is a pretty difficult thing to get to accomplish. We also noticed that per acre, there's an awful lot more phosphorus coming out of the Ontario watersheds than on the U.S. watersheds. And these 2 graphs show this. This is the left is the total phosphorus loss yield, which is the kilograms of phosphorus per hectare coming off of the individual areas. Left one is the total phosphorus, right is dissolved. And particularly in dissolved, you can see that the loss yields were much higher on the Ontario side. And this is likely due to different soil characteristics, but interestingly, it's actually a lot wetter on the Ontario side than it is on the Michigan side. So the higher rainfall and the different soil characteristics is probably what's causing that. But seeing this, we then wanted to test, well, what if we applied these same practices, ran the same SWOT model, but only did the practices on the 55% of the land that had the highest phosphorus losses. And you can see even doing that, which was probably easier to implement, certainly cheaper to implement, we're still in the Sydenham and the Thames looking at 50 to 60% load reduction. And so that could be possible if you could get that much application on those lands. The quick summary here, before I go to the next slide, is that, again, the load from Lake Huron is 50% of the total. The treatment plant has already been reduced by 54%. If you don't do anything about Lake Huron or the treatment plant, to meet the 40% reduction requires a 72% reduction from the other sources. Hitting that target from agricultural lands alone is unlikely. If you could do something with the treatment plant in Lake Huron, you might get closer into the doable range. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the governance structure underneath it created the whole process in an adaptive management framework. So there's a committee that is actually now looking at how they might adapt the plans based on this new information. And are just starting that process. And so we're suggesting, though, some of the things they might want to think about including in their adaptation would be the following. One is to find a way to incentivize more conservation to try to get at that 72% load reduction. Probably not possible. You could reduce in the Lake Huron and the treatment plant loads by 10 to 15%, and that would put the non-point source reduction more within reach. Again, that would be sort of difficult, but that's a way to think about it. They could also relax the Detroit River 40% load reduction and make up the difference from other watersheds. Politically charged, trying to assign that load to someone else. You could also just relax the overall 40% load reduction target to the Western and Central Basin and accept more hypoxia, a larger dead zone. Some combinations of those could also be effective. But this is where we are right now. The U.S. and Canada committees are now looking at this and trying to decide what their next step might be. Just wanted to end with why this really matters. Lake Erie provides drinking water for 11 million people. There's over 20 power points. 40% of the Great Lakes charter boats are in Lake Erie. It supports a $1 billion sport fishery. It is the largest freshwater commercial fishery in the world. So it's worth trying to protect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I agree with that. I guess one of the things also that factors into this, right, is climate change. This could all get worse with heavier rainfalls and more winds and that sort of thing, and less ice. How are people thinking about that? Are they trying not to think about it because the issue is complex enough as it is?
No, there are people thinking about it, focusing on it. I think the effect of climate change on the Lake Huron load is new. People are just trying to wrap their heads around that part. But folks that have been doing the watershed modeling in the Maumee River, which is the other major contributor, and the Detroit one, have been running scenarios of the watershed models being driven by some of the climate projections. And you're right, in most cases, the increased rain, increased intensity in the spring storms tends to increase the loads. There's a bit of a silver lining in some of the work that's being done, showing that while the increased precipitation will increase the loads, the increased temperature mitigates that a bit. It tends to have less snow, so the precipitation is spread out over time a bit more, and there's more evapotranspiration, so there's a bit less water. The loads still go up, but not as much if it wasn't for the temperature effect. So right. People are paying attention to it.
Great. I guess last question for you, and maybe you can't answer this one because it's a bit political, but if you could pick a package of things that would be done, what do you think is the best bang for the buck, or what's the most realistic, or if you had the magic wand, what would you make happen?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a all the above kind of guy in these cases. The the amount of time it's going to take to affect a real difference. I had some experience working on the Mississippi in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's been decades working there, and things are moving very, very slowly. So I would suggest look put in place the agricultural best management practices as much as you can, as many places as you can. See if the technology improvements might help some with the Detroit plant. I know they're always working on ways to reduce that. Work on reducing the phosphorus content in the sediments in Lake Huron. In other words, do all of them and continue to monitor and see whether or not it's making a difference. Just start moving in the right direction.
Great. Thanks so much, Don. I really appreciate your taking the time to do this. And this is a ton of work. You make it seem easy, but I know this is a big, big project. So I really appreciate what you and your team have done here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take care.
All right.